I point out that although I've been involved in a number of groups, I'm representing myself and my own opinions today. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and other sentient beings as may be present. I'd like to give you a little bit of my background and interest in UFOs. Alfred Adler, the psychologist, pointed out that early memories are very important. And my earliest memory of UFOs, I don't know when it was, but I know it was before 1951 because I remember where we lived. And the news was on the radio, and there had been some kind of sighting or landing. And of course, today I like to convince myself that I was hearing about Roswell, but that's pure imagination. And my father drove home from work, and I said, Dad, the flying saucers, could they come from Mars or other planets? And he thought about it a moment. He said, well, son, he says, I don't know, but I'm sure we'll have all the answers within 6 months. My background's in SETI, and I'm sure everybody here knows that there's been tension between SETI and ufology, and that has a historical basis. And that historical basis is that in the 1950s, 1960s, when SETI was trying to get established, it was trying to distance itself as much as possible from science fiction, from pure speculation, from the Space Brothers, from Orthon, from Mrs. Keach and her Millennial Group. And so that started that militancy. And I think it's eased to some extent over time. The changes have come about because of changes in our own way for searching for life in the universe, and also, I think, just sort of a slightly more mellow world. I've never been a victim of the open victim of the hostility or ridicule that comes from interest in UFOs. Now, my interest is primarily how people will react, how people think about life on other worlds. And my belief is that you cannot do this without taking UFOs and people who talk about UFOs into account and giving them deep consideration. I have seen discussions of reactions to life on other worlds where there's tremendous care to avoid any hint, mention, or allusion to UFOs, except indirectly, such as having in one case, a person had a Kleenex box covered with aluminum foil and said, of course, there could be a probe in our galaxy. Nobody reacts to that if you're holding up a little silvery thing, about this side. But my personal view, is that we cannot understand our place in the cosmos, our transition from a global to a cosmic society, and do decent planning on easing that transition without looking at UFOs, ufologists, and people's beliefs about UFOs. To try to do otherwise would be like looking at a scene with a semi-detached retina. So I'm very much interested in UFOs. Oh, by the way, a message for the backstage. The countdown clock is not working, but I'm trying to keep track of time anyway. Okay, so everybody here knows that there's basically 3 tracks in ufology. The first is the nuts and bolts science track, structured craft, how do they work? The second is sort of the semi-mystical, greater consciousness, spirituality track, sort of in between religion and science, such as Ted was talking about. And the third is what I call the gumshoe track. And by gumshoe, I'm referring to private investigators. And that involves looking at history, current politics, and saying, what's going on, what can we learn from these various examples. What I'd like to touch upon today, and I can only touch upon, is first of all, what would motivate a government to suppress information confirming the existence of extraterrestrial life? We can pick different terms: disclosure, confirmation, acknowledgement, but, why would a government want to keep this information back? The second, if we look at the motives that have been ascribed to government for maintaining secrecy, do these motives really withstand close scrutiny? And I suggest that they don't, although I will only be able to talk about a couple of motives in depth. Are there countervailing motives for transparency or openness? Yes, my goodness. There are tremendous countervailing motives for being open and honest and matters having to do with our place in the universe. Do governments strengthen fears and suspicions that they hope to dispel? I think the answer to this one is yes. That various bureaucratic procedures, the way organizations function under stress, these kinds of things actually enhance the illusion, I don't know about the factuality, enhance the illusion of cover-up. And finally, are we ever going to get out of this mess? Is it possible to somehow get to some point where people are satisfied that they know what's going on and are able to come to grips with this? Okay, now, my big quest, everybody has opinions about SETI, ET, UFOs, extraterrestrial life, and my big quest has been to try to draw on knowledge from the social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, to develop arguments, rather than, oh my God, one of my nephews, I mentioned I was speaking here, says, everybody's going to freak out and panic. They're not ready for this. It's going to be terrible. Well, I don't agree. And whenever we talk about speculative topics, whether it's ET, UFOs, or life beyond death, there's some kind of mix of evidence and opinion, and I'm trying to increase the contributions of evidence and reduce the contributions of opinion. It's very difficult because when you address audiences, when it comes right down to it, it's the gut reaction that counts, not the statistical tables, not the experiments, not the survey kinds of results. And it's my belief that even incomplete data can help. My feeling is that one of ufology's biggest problems is not a lack of data, it's too much data, too contradictory and too much conflicting data that makes it difficult to sift through. Almost like in SETI, looking for that civilization out there, the needle in the cosmic haystack. In ufology, it's looking for the real case in this big batch of information. Now, conspiracy theories are prominent in the United States, and they have a long and honorable history. They're proliferating like crazy. Just a few of the historical examples of conspiracies, real or imagined, LBJ in the Vietnam War. He lied to us. It turned out that the destroyers were not fired upon. I remember thinking, oh man, I'm going to get drafted tomorrow, hearing that our ships had been fired upon. Watergate, Iran-Contra scandal, weapons of mass destruction, WikiLeaks. Gee whiz, who would have ever guessed that there might be some monitoring of our communications? Operation PRISM, Snowden, who's sitting in Russia trying to figure out what to do next. And of course, you can go on and on. 9/11, the Kennedy assassination. They're just very, very rampant. And of the different conspiracy theories, the UFO conspiracy theories, I think, take precedence. That they were fostered during the 1940s and 50s, the Cold War. Everybody's here, I suspect, is aware of what UFO historians have said in works about the history of UFOs, and they're still with us. So I think they're important. If you're just interested in conspiracy theories, I think they're important for three reasons. One is seniority, okay? Others have come and gone, like MIAs, missing in actions. If your grandpa's still in North Korea, he's probably dead by now. The second is widespread acceptance by the general public. I don't have the figures for the Trade Center disaster, that it was somehow rigged by our government agencies, but I do. We do have evidence that large numbers of people believe in UFO cover-ups. And then finally, there's the interest expressed by high elected officials, such as President Bill Clinton. Now, conspiracies, they strike you as wrong because they seem unethical, but they're much more, it's much deeper than that. Richard Hofstadter, writing on conspiracies, he wrote a book on the paranoid style in American politics. He didn't really mean paranoid as a psychologist might use it, but what really happened in Dealey Plaza or during a UFO sighting has implications far beyond the suppression of the truth. People strongly perceive conspiracy theories because they represent an assault on the way of life. The real issue is the alleged conspirators violate national traditions and values. There's a discrepancy between the way that the government is supposed to work and the way that it does work, a conflict between the public's right to know and the way the government conducts itself. So it's like there's something really important here. If anybody backstage could get the countdown going, I'm realizing what's going on already, and I'm going to speed up. Skepticism is in order. And now you're going to say, oh boy, this guy was trained by Seth Shostak. Well, not necessarily, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's very easy to use cover-up or conspiracy to explain away gaps in theories or arguments. And, I think things that go on within organizations conspire to create impressions of conspiracies and cover-ups, even if they don't occur. I don't agree with John Alexander on all things, but I thought his treatment of the bureaucracy in politics was a great example of how things work. In 1996, the graduate student and I developed a paper on conspiracies, focusing primarily on the Kennedy assassination, but also UFOs. And we argued that these are the results of normal cognitive processes that generate hypotheses about conspiracies, and then these hypotheses are confirmed by the way governments and their agencies react, such as taking forever and a day to respond to a FOIA request, or such as giving two conflicting reports on the same thing. We can't disprove a conspiracy theory. No matter what's revealed, some people will feel that disclosure is not being complete. And I think there's an aspect that we rarely think about in our daily capacities as citizens. These conspiracy theories are not really helping run the government right now. And maybe that's justifiable or deserved. But for somebody who's a good, hard-working bureaucrat, it's very tough. Well, what are some of the motives that we ascribe to government for secrecy? First is to prevent panic. The second is to avoid social upheaval in terms of runaway social change, some sort of horrible society that's even more horrible than the one we live in right now. Gain geopolitical advantage through alien technology, through forming alliances and coalitions, and to avoid embarrassment. In other words, to avoid a situation where you have to say something like, well, Senator so-and-so, we have to report that we've known about some of these things for about 50 years, and we don't really understand it. We just know that it's there, that it's real, and we're working on it, but we're not getting very far. And that's a very embarrassing thing, say if you're an admiral who is reporting to the Congress on this topic, and that's how embarrassment sort of fits in. And I saw a wonderful example. The problem, of course, is embarrassment. It's nothing compared to the embarrassment that if the situation unfolds in a completely uncontrolled way. And there was a clip for a science fiction movie that I don't remember the name. It was great. It's the alien bombs are landing and people are running every which way, and somebody saying, "You knew about this for 50 years and you didn't do anything," So there's different degrees of embarrassment. Okay, panic is often advanced as a means for discouraging, for suppressing information. And where this really goes back to is the War of the Worlds broadcast, Orson Welles broadcast, which everybody's heard about, which is taught about in every class, and which, as far as I'm concerned, is grotesquely misunderstood. Yeah, you have to understand that at that time, there are very disparaging theories of humans and human behavior. Social Darwinism, the elite, and then there's the great unwashed that can't control themselves. They're foolish, they're stupid, they're impulsive. That's the 99%, and there's the 1% like me, if I was president or whatever, that can deal with this stuff. The second is a Frenchman by the name of Gustave Le Bon wrote a book on how crowds go mad. And he was great at telling stories. He was short on data, but he was still frequently cited. Everybody's going to go crazy and run around wild in the streets. And then we're getting back to Sigmund Freud with these unpleasant impulses coming from the id that we can't control. Okay, well, the broadcast, War of the Worlds broadcast, is actually quite significant in social psychology because it was a classic study. It was one of the first times that surveys followed. There were sensationalistic accounts in the media, and the problem with it is that it fuses contact or conflates contact and military invasion, and that it bears almost no resemblance to any contact scenario, including those associated with astrobiology and SETI. No. If the Canadians had decided to come across the border, advance on Manhattan, that might create concern also. The fact that these were aliens, maybe it was enhanced because of their, greater military power. So here's how people cope with threats such as the War of the Worlds broadcast. First, they notice it. Okay, here's this thing on the radio. Is it dangerous? If no, you don't worry about it. If it sounds like it's dangerous, then you go to step two. Is it relevant to me? It may be dangerous for people in Bangladesh, but is it, a problem in Las Vegas right now? And lots of times the result is, well, it doesn't really affect me. It's not a problem. Now, what happened in the War of the Worlds broadcast is many people sought to validate that the invasion was in fact going on and were able to invalidate that. There were some misfires. For example, a woman who tuned to another station, got church music, and took this as confirmation. Then you go to problem solving. Okay, gee whiz, it's real. I'm living in Trenton, New Jersey, and they're coming my way. Okay, problem solving. Is there something I can do, to escape or evade the situation, like fight, flight, talk my way out of it, to protect myself? This is sort of reality-based problem solving. And if that doesn't work, if there's no hope, what you do is you resort on psychological defense mechanisms to make yourself feel better. And so the first attack is to try to deal with it in reality. Then the second is to try to come up with rationalizations, denials, hopes, and so forth that spare yourself and make you think it's not going to be a big deal. Now, what I see when I look at the War of the Worlds broadcast is a lot of problem solving. Here's stuff that was described as panic. People quit in the middle of a wedding reception and went home. Was that panic, or was that a sensible thing to do? Men appeared at the armory for what was known as the militia, and now it's known as the National Guard. They didn't have to be told to do it, they just showed up. One guy went racing way too fast to pick up his girlfriend at college. This is seen as an example of panic. Going out to help your girlfriend, that's panic? I mean, what would you want, And in terms of feeling better, one woman and some people are prepared to die, and they put on good clothes and prayed. Okay? That's based on a misunderstanding of the situation. But these are sensible responses. This is not crazy stuff. Panic is misused a lot. A phrase like when they saw the tidal wave come in, they panicked and they ran up on the beach. Well, sorry, man, that's a good type of behavior. Well, what does the evidence say in terms of what's likely to happen if we run into on confirmation day, disclosure day, contact day, whatever. Well, first line of evidence comes from survey research. Shows that many people accept and are comfortable with the idea of extraterrestrial intelligence. And in fact, Dr. Greer mentioned that yesterday at the press conference. And we'll get into a little of those figures and stuff. Okay? They're already prepared for the possibility, and they're okay with it. Not all, but okay with it. History gets a little murky because you have to be careful picking which example you're going to give and which ones you're going to look the other way on. But my personal take is that during periods of time when large numbers of people believed that ET had been discovered or detected, the reactions were anything other than panic. Okay? And I'm going to give you a list of those, very, very brief comments. And then finally, and I'm probably going to have to skip over this, but if the whole field of disaster studies and sociology finds that panic is rare, even in major disasters, and that people take sensible self-protective and actions, and that they try to help other people. Example, carrying a woman in a wheelchair down 92 floors in the Trade Center. Examples, there's tons of examples. And when sociology started into this area of disaster studies, shortly after World War II, they had trouble finding examples of panic. Bombing attack intended to knock Germany and then Japan out of the war. It killed lots of people, it did lots of damage. And various cities, such as Hamburg, and I think even Hiroshima, a lot of basic services were restored and order was restored within a very short period of time. They knock out the ball bearing factories in the war, they're producing again, So it's disaster studies. The basic pitch here is that people respond very well to disasters, most people, most of the time, and that the stuff that you see is wild and wild-eyed, crazy responses is very, very rare. Okay, survey research. Survey polls are very difficult because they're difficult to conduct because you have to get the right sample. You have to phrase the questions just right. You have to hope that people are going to give honest responses. And we know that there's certain biases in the way that people respond to surveys. A good example is the positivity bias when they're talking about themselves. You got a scale of 1 to 10. How self-confident are you? They really feel a 3, but they're going to tell you 5. Okay, if you ask them if they're above average or below average drivers of automobiles, I don't know the exact number, but it's something like 100% or above average. So there's this little bit of a self-serving bias that needs to be taken into account. Well, the reason I like the NIDS-Roper poll was that it was conducted by the Roper organization, and it didn't have a lot of silly questions in it like so many polls do today, like, who do you think would be better equipped, to deal with ET, the Hulk or Superman? They didn't have any of that stuff in it. So here's what people thought in 1999. Alien spaceships was number 1. A lot of people didn't know, but here was a significant, here's a quarter of the population. Generally runs between a quarter and a half, maybe sometimes a little higher. Thought that UFOs were alien spaceships. Another, this gets us to disclosure. Now look at that. Here's why UFO conspiracy theory deserves a grade of A for penetrating people's minds, at least. That if you look at the bottom 2 responses, well, tell us right away. Not even 10%, But that they classify the information, and even more classify the information and suppress people that try to reveal it, the old bodies in the desert kind of thing. That this was the predominant response, not a response, the predominant response. That how much of an effect would it have on your life? Now remember, according to the War of the Worlds model, we're all going to go crazy and start running around in circles and shouting and trying to find police officers to beat up just for the fun of it or whatever. 3% thought it would be a large effect. 11% moderate effect, which means, gee, I better read up on this stuff. Slight effect, not at all. And then 16% who cares, don't believe it. So it's like there doesn't seem to be a great pre-potential here to react adversely. Are you prepared? Instead of making guesses and predictions based on my fantasies or theories, are you prepared? Fully prepared, 32%. Have to learn more about it. You can sort of see it. And it goes down to a fair number of people would be bothered, but only 5% would be distraught, and 30% don't care. Now that's hard to interpret because it includes they really don't care, and it also includes they really don't think it's going to happen, so they're not going to bother giving a response. But once again, we are prepared. Now, if we put the shoe on the other foot and say, how would other people react? And unfortunately, in this poll, they're not all the same. What happens is that they don't see other people as fully prepared as themselves. I'm going to have to sort of really start skimming, but 2005 National Geographic poll, key points. Majority of people think life's out there. 45% of the respondents expect that we'll find it. There'll be confirmation soon. Of the respondents who are open to the idea of extraterrestrial life, they expect to respond positively. Only 20% expected to be afraid and nervous. And those who are not open to the idea of extraterrestrial life point to religious beliefs and failure so far to find evidence. Again, we're going through simply more polls, more recent polls. But what's here is a remarkable level of consistency in the sense that people are open and don't seem to be particularly worried about it. Here's 2012, 36% UFOs exist, and 11% have spotted UFOs, 20% know somebody who has. These are not unusual things that nobody's ever thought about. Well, we can also, so if you look at the survey research data, it sounds as if things are going to be, it's pretty encouraging. But that's not a real situation, is it? We have situations throughout history where large numbers of people believed that extraterrestrial life had been discovered. One of the first that I'm aware of was the discovery of Batman frolicking on the moon. It was a wonderful hoax. It was perpetrated by the New York Sun, which was the first penny paper. It was smaller than the other papers, tabloid, and it had articles that people wanted to read rather than the latest financial or shipping news or that type of thing. New York at that time was a very dynamic, in some way conflict-laden location. A lot of the tensions on abolition and slavery took place in New York because Southern companies had offices in New York. There was a lot of resentment against immigrants coming in, but there's also wonders of Phineas T. Barnum's American Museum, wonders of a menagerie, a zoo. Come see the elephants, come see the camel, these amazing creatures that nobody really had seen before. And over a period of several months, in a very clever way, the person who wrote the article was able to convince everybody that a famous British astronomer who was cataloging stars down from Africa was observing these creatures living in peace and harmony with temples and so forth. And it was a real great striptease, so to speak. I mean, there were days there was no new information, and it really convinced a lot of people. They didn't do polls, but several commentators of the day, like Edgar Allan Poe, suggested at least 50% of the people were fooled. And the guy who wrote the articles was walking around town, and he would find people presenting information, saying things like, "Oh yes, I saw Sir John Herschel load his telescope onto the ship as he was getting ready to sail to Africa. 40,000 power telescope with no loss of clarity or illumination. And that's how he could spy this. It was all a joke. Everybody survived, and people were really intrigued. Whoops. Sorry about that. Everybody knows about the canals on Mars, okay? The people were interested. Was there a dying civilization on Mars, or was the engineers were creating these this canal system to transport water around to save everybody? And there were influential astronomers involved in this. They thought they saw the canals. Now we know it was a trick of the eye, okay? The question was not one of how do we protect ourselves from these dudes. It was how can we contact them? Do we build big fires? Do we grow crops in rows of, to make triangles or something, There's no fear. I've already talked about the world's broadcast. It's misrepresentative, but it is negative. UFO sightings, okay? These come out all the time. How often do people panic? The people I know that have had UFO sightings, and a lot of the stuff I've read, I'm not talking about abductions, but UFO sightings, they find them interesting. They want to know more. They're disappointed that the sighting was so quick, that they only had 15 seconds, 45 minutes to see this, and it went away. And this isn't, running for the caves. The next two bullets simply refer to times that looked like there had been SETI discoveries. Both of them turned out to be hoaxes. It did make the BBC, I think. And the news did get out for a few days before it was squelched. But no financial panics, anything like that. I even looked up the stock market for those days that the news broke. And finally, more than 1 million people have participated in SETI at home. Now, would you think that if people are really scared of this, they're going to volunteer their home computer? Just think, you, Jane Doe, could be responsible for the downfall of terra firma because your software found the buggers. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't seem to work that way. I'm going to go quickly through disaster studies because I have a little more material. What happens is that people respond pretty well in disasters. I'm talking about technological and natural disasters. I'm not talking about politically inspired kinds of things. Yes, those were problems that you saw in Tiananmen Square or in Egypt. But the stereotype of disasters is very alive and very well and very, very strong. And the idea that people respond to with frenzied, repetitive, useless behaviors, and they're elbowing other people out of the way and stuff like that. That the crime and destructive behaviors go up. Okay, this is really entrenched. Looters, for goodness sakes. And then, of course, the people can't help themselves. They have to wait around for the National Guard and the cops and firemen, so forth, to come. Well, that's what people believe. This is a false belief. Again, we can go back to like the World Trade Center. People on the scene are the first responders. The cops, firemen, wonderful job. And they weren't the first. People there were doing things. And by the way, I got immersed in this because of an interest in planetary defense and what might happen if we were threatened with an asteroid or comet. True panic occurs when you have a narrow window of time for escape, and that's closing. So yes, a fire burning a building down, there's one door, there's going to be panic, and that door's going to get jammed. You won't be able to get out. Ship going down. Financial markets. I want to sell my stock before you sell your stock, and it goes down. Those are true panic kinds of situations. So I've already talked a little bit about disaster realities, and they're complicated. Rioting and looting, criminal behavior in the case of Katrina was unbelievably overstated by the media. And in disasters, yes, there are conflicts sometimes between cops and the police and the people. But usually that's where there's pre-existing social tendencies, pre-existing social tensions and other problems to begin with, or they're provoked. For example, when someone tells you you can't go in your house to rescue your property, or pulls out a gun to point at you before finding out what you're doing in the situation. And these survive because of they've been around a long time, they're built up by the media, they're selectively perceived and entered into memory to sort of reinforce this idea of that people will panic. And again, there are certain things that authorities can do that help create self-fulfilling prophecies, which do bring on exactly that kind of behavior that they hope to avoid. Now, what I've been arguing is that people are slow to panic, but there's a list of, there's a new line of research in sociology called elite panic. And by elite, what we're talking about is governments, military agencies, police, mayors, people in position of authorities that feel they need to maintain control. And that they're very, very primed to see evidence of panic, and that they tend to respond with force and authoritarian kinds of measures that these in turn upset the public and cause various kinds of problems, okay? And so what happens when the elite panic? The issue becomes one of control rather than helping people. And this, of course, makes the situation worse. When they finally get it under control by sending, in the helicopters, then they say, look, our methods are wonderful. Okay. These are just some of the symptoms. More concerned with property than people. See people as enemies rather than victims, and so forth. Now, this comes back to UFOs in terms of, I think, perceptions of how people are likely to react, say, if a UFO were found within the solar system unassailably, okay? No doubt. Okay, end of society as we know it. I'm going to go through this one very quickly. Basically, what the idea is, as you know, people are familiar with the Brookings report on the peaceful uses of outer space. I'm sure I've seen this phrase. Societies sure of their own place in the universe have disintegrated when confronted by a superior society, and others have survived even though changed. And this seems to be sort of a red flag. Uh-oh, this isn't going to work out very well. Roberto Pignati. Contact will create a crisis of authority, and Earth's superpowers would quickly be reduced to the status of Andorra, Monaco, and the Republic of San Marino. Today's establishment worldwide would have everything to lose from any form of contact with ETI, since it would be the first victim in a frontal collision between different civilizations. So what do you do? How do you try to support this kind of a statement? Well, there's been lots of cultural encounters, and some of the ones that are used to sort of show how horrible we can be to one another, the Roman Empire, Cortez in the New World, French and British on some occasions, westward expansion, wiping out the Native Americans and treating them with tremendous injustice. Commodore Perry going to Japan, and it was supposed to be peaceful. He had direct orders from the president, but he imposed his will by means of marching Marines around town and shooting off cannons from boats and stuff like that. And then, of course, the horrible age of imperialism, where I'm not sure that's the correct title, but from 1800 to end of World War I, where colonies would be formed, like the Congo. It didn't belong to Belgium, it belonged to the King of Belgium. It was like his personal money factory and stuff, Well, the thing about cultural encounters is that they go every which way. The thing about cultural encounters is that they're always written about from a particular point of view. And that particular point of view frequently has to do with showing how powerful and effective one is. In the case of Cortez, for example, proving to the ruling class that he was the right person to send, that he had things under control. And when you actually take time to read about it, get beyond the standard, very, very brief stuff that we find in history books, you find out it's incredibly complicated. all kinds of winners and losers, all kinds of struggles, all kinds of problems, and mixed outcomes, not always identical outcomes. So it's a mixed bag, okay? And after contact, anything that happens to us is going to be a product of largely of ourselves, and then whatever interactions we might have with the others. So I can't be quite as forceful on this one, but there are many examples where cultures have benefited from encounters with radically different cultures, and where things have gone smoothly, and when after a period of turbulence and things not going well, there have been periods of gain in technology, food production, education, things like that. So I don't think that's a good reason. You know, the idea that society might change, society's going to change anyway, whether or not we ever discover ET. Okay, this is just a little bit more on the threats. But there's also opportunities, and this has already come up with Ted's speech, that the kinds of things that we might gain from acknowledgement or from attempting to act in interaction, and I understand there's religious interpretations of this, but the opportunity for practical information, okay? So now we're looking at these countervailing things, these motives that would make it sense to disclose, new answers to old questions, scientific, philosophical, religious, meaning of life, and then spiritual kinds of transformations, okay, which is something I'm interested in different ways, I think, or maybe even similar ways. A lot of people in ufology, Mac, I think I understand several of the other writers, they see this as a possible result. And so anyway, so that's a mixed bag. Geopolitical advantage, I don't really have a lot to say about. I would say that if you have access to some kind of alliance of technology that other groups don't have, that you may not know what they have, and there might be some advantage to Earth working as a whole, you know, if ET were discovered. Embarrassment I already talked about. So the summary is, do not accept panic and social upheaval following confirmation as an article of faith. I think it's really unlikely under most scenarios. People are comfortable with the idea of extraterrestrial intelligence. Humanity has successfully negotiated periods when lots of people, including intelligent, educated people, believed that ET was out there. And people are typically slow to panic, and it's really easy to see panic when it's not present. And finally, the cultural encounters are very complicated kinds of things. Don't just take the worst case and then use that to extrapolate to what might happen in the case of encounters with ET. So and finally, almost finally, let's let the good times roll. However, what's going to happen? Where are we going to be 25 years from now? Okay? Are things going to be changed? I mean, as far as I can see, where we were roughly 40, 50 years ago. Okay, one possibility is that there will be no resolution, that will be the same as today, and that all of the conspiracy theories, or many conspiracy theories, will consider to continue to flourish. Another possibility is that disclosure will have occurred, or confirmation, or revealing the truth, and this would seem to depend on there being a relatively low level of elite fear, you know, loss of control, and something of substance to reveal. You know, maybe in fact there will be some kind of revelation that we've been in contact or they found us or whatever. But the one I favor is that the way this will resolve is not by governments revealing secrets, which they may or may not have, and if they have, may or may not ever want to reveal, sort of an end run, where independent researchers, some kind of event makes it impossible to deny that confirmation has occurred, if it's going to occur. And that what this will do is it will bring us around, sort of circumvent the issue a little bit, and leave a lot of ideas about cover-up irrelevant, because we will have independently established, you know, what's really going on. So, And thank you very much. I will do a quick commercial. This is Civilisations Beyond Earth. It's coming out in paperback, hardback, only $100. But this is supposed to be for students and stuff. It basically has to do with the role of anthropology in SETI and what may come. Then my other two, this is co-edited with Doug Vachach of the SETI Institute. My favorite, I think the best work in 40 years that I ever did was After Contact, the human response to extraterrestrial life. It's ancient, it needs to be revised, but it's still good. And I have enough sense not to suggest to the publisher that there be a second edition. And finally, Starstruck, which is actually deals with a lot of the issues I've talked about today, and particularly looks at links between science, religion, and UFOs, and how I see all this as a part of a larger process of coming of age in the universe, and that UFOs do contribute to this process. So that's what I had to say, and I'd be happy to take questions if we have any time. I'm kind of clueless on time. The countdown clock didn't do its thing. So if there's any questions, please feel free. I came to learn as well as to talk. So, yeah.
Thank you for the mic. Mic on? Okay. Thank you for taking a question. Over the years, I found myself saying more than once, don't believe a word I say, but you might be interested in those 10,000 pages of government documents we've acquired through FOIA and by hook and crook. Would you comment on why one of our big institutions, the media, has not paid more attention to the military base intrusions, pilot sightings, and other information that would seem to be irrefutable by our biggest authorities?
Yes, I would be happy to comment on that. Everyone here is aware of barriers of fear and ridicule with respect to anything to do with UFOs. And my understanding from talking to journalists and writers, is that these kinds of stories never really seem to go anywhere. That's why they've quit writing about them, except in specialized journals and now in blogs and so forth. And that it's like that there's very much of a deaf ear. An unkind way of putting what happens in ufology is a person that I was good friends with who retired from ufology a few years ago. He was doing great work. I liked his work. I quote it. His ideas are in a lot of my writings. And I said, why are you kicking in the bucket on this? And he said, every day there's some sort of exciting new development, and every night we're back where we used to be. But I think that the heart of the matter is that the stories tend not to go anywhere. The power of the ridicule apparatus. Ridicule and fear are very close. That if you're afraid of something, one way you can deal with it is you can ridicule it. And what ridicule is, in part, and maybe Don or somebody will correct me on this, it's when you're scared of something and then you realize it's not a threat. So Chicken Little comes running in, says the sky's falling, you get scared, and it turns out it's not true, and so you laugh at Chicken Little. That's triangulating on a straight answer. But I think that they find they don't get very far, with these kinds of stories. And then, there's all the other stuff, you know about. When a lot of the stuff is looking back at what happened a long time ago. Okay. So SETI and ufology have different problems to deal with. What SETI does is SETI looks at billions of cases trying to find one that will fit. I mean, they have this tremendous ability to sift through signals. They're looking for that one hit. What happens in ufology is that you have a case, and the evidence is equivocal. Some favors an ET explanation, some doesn't, and you have to sort of keep going through it, and new pieces, keep coming in. So it's very, very different problems that the two approaches have to deal with. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Do you see any political advantage to some nations, France, Canada, Britain, not America, releasing their UFO documents? Is there some political advantage why those nations choose to do it and America does not?
I think that there's many people that are more, sitting right here right now, they're a lot more familiar with that issue than I am. But from what I can tell, there's great happiness to try to get rid of UFO materials. And one way to work at it is to say, here, we're going to tell you about this or that. And of course, there's never proof that that's the whole story, and that's why it doesn't really work. I don't know if a nation would gain ascendancy by providing unequivocal truth. But I think lots of places are releasing documents, whether it's the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I'm not qualified to comment on. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi. Secrecy has become almost institutionalized here in the United States, and you cited several studies that indicated while perhaps some sociological studies of general populace are not tending prone to panic, whereas institutions perhaps are. I wondered if any of those studies you cited there on the screen, or any you know of, take into account any of the so-called panic reactions from military individuals because they
I'm
are
sorry,
in a
panic reactions from what?
They're the military individuals that are under aegis of control from hierarchy. Such what comes to mind for me is the Bentwaters incident, where there were actual recordings of individuals that are having difficulty dealing with the situation that they encountered, and there were many others, for instance, at nuclear missile sites, wondering what the heck we're going to do with this in the face of this. Were there any studies that you know of, or are there any published ones that take into account military reactions to panic?
Okay, fair enough. In World War I, it was combat fatigue or something, and then it became battle fatigue, and now it's post-traumatic stress disorder. The soldiers that go out and fight, in many cases, it's the same small group. Some of them do succumb to shell shock or PTSD. Not all do, but some do. And that could happen, I suppose. And it may happen in the case if you accept alien abductions at face value, then PTSD would sort of flow in fairly naturally, I think. I'm very willing to concede that the alien armada, arriving and shooting up people could cause problems. What I think is going to happen is this. I think we're going to get some evidence that's very, very, very suggestive, or maybe even a really confirmed SETI hit. But we're not going to know much else, okay? It's going to create what some people call cosmic anxiety. People aren't going to panic, but they're going to be nervous. And what will happen, we could go one of two ways, and it'll be determined by us, not by E.T., who's light years away, and we really don't know anything about him. And that's maybe one of the major results of confirmation or contact. We're going to make our own destiny. Now, I've tried to think of what would really scare the hell out of me. One thing that would scare the hell out of me would be a Sputnik-type device, preferably large, clumsily painted so that it looked like they tried to camouflage it, but still easily visible, sort of going around the world like an apple core back and forth. That would get my attention, but I'm not sure it's going to go that way. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. Is it true that we have already had disclosure if, for example, only 50% or even less of the Majestic 12 documents are genuine, and if the many other documents and the statements by ex-presidents and other military officials, don't we already have a partial, maybe unintentional disclosure?
the problem with that, from the viewpoint, it would be really easy and fun and pleasant to see, yes. The problem with it has to do with document interpretation and analysis, the problems of stuff like fraud. And I mean, you read this stuff and you look at it and, well, is this signature right? Is this the right font and so forth? And most people aren't going to be able to tell, be able to tell. And I understand from your reaction, you're absolutely convinced this happened. But not everybody, maybe I'm wrong, but not everybody accepts that. The first article I wrote was called Psychology and Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And I had a co-author by the name of Alan Elms. And it came up that my co-author may have been in the, quote, no, and that he was somehow involved in the cover-up and stuff, and it had to do, I couldn't quite follow all the reasoning. I mentioned it to him, he just sort of laughed. I don't think he was. He did, however, work with psychologists at Yale. And if you looked at some of the stuff on stress and panic and stuff that was coming out of Yale at that time. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I'm saying some people accept it, some don't. But what you have to have is something that is like totally unassailable. And when we're examining documents, that we can pick, we look at this, we look at that, we make this conclusion, we make that conclusion. Try the Kennedy assassination if you really want to have fun. I got into the whole cover-up thing because I knew a guy who had access to the Kennedy file. Found out it was measured in acres or something like that. And I thought, okay, you're not going to get the truth out of this. It's too much stuff. Okay, rambly, but I hear what you're saying, but I think it's still possible for some people that have different perspectives not to conclude that this has really happened. And I know we're going to get a lot of good talks later in this that'll refute me and make me want to go out and have a beer. Thank you.
I know of one field study of a reasonably small-scale panic involving UFOs.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm a little hard of hearing. I'm going to have.
Okay. I remember a fairly small-scale study of a panic that actually happened in Brazil involving UFOs. It was written by Jacques Vallée, and it was about an invasion of things everybody called chupa-chupas, which were flying refrigerator-shaped items that had red beams that went right through ceilings and burned people. And this city in the Amazon region, basically, all of the officials fled, leaving the populace to cope. And eventually the Brazilian army went in there and documented the whole thing. And eventually whatever was doing that went away, but nobody ever solved it.
Yeah, I don't know. I do know, for example, that the amount of documentation for the Robert Kennedy, not John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy assassination, the documents, if you just stack them all up, they're higher than the Washington Monument. The Zapruder film with the JFK assassination, it's been, I'm sorry, okay. It's been gone over again and again, and it's gotten down to things like the tension of the spring, the idea being that there was more tension in the spring during the first part, the second part. I know there's people here with good reputations who put tremendous work in on documents, forensics, know a heck of a lot more than I do. And I'm not challenging expertise, I'm not challenging sincerity. What I am challenging is the ability to somehow get other people to take a careful look rather than to just dismiss it with a flip of the hand and that type of thing. I mean, there's I understand ufology is a very complicated kind of thing. And I've got lots of friends who've seen UFOs, and it's different from reading about them in a book, isn't it? When one of your relatives or somebody you work with has a very involved sighting that they can describe in great detail. Yes, ma'am.
I think one of the important things that keeps our government suppressing things is because they're trying to appease the corporations that are really in control of and monopolizing power, meaning fuel, and they're afraid of free power, afraid our financial system will dissolve, and they're afraid that the technology might become free, and that scares them. And so the government is going along with that. Does that make sense?
When I was a kid, there was the idea that the oil companies had developed a carburetor that could get 60 miles a gallon, then brought up the patent and hid it. Now they've apparently released it. I'm distrustful of the corporate structure and its influence. I'm a liberal. I come from a liberal community. A lot of my friends drive Priuses and are vegetarians. But I also got friends who drive giant Ford pickup trucks and work on oil rigs and things like that. And corporations have a huge involvement in everything. And I, too, feel as if maybe it gets back to Eisenhower with the military-industrial complex, the famous speech he gave when he left the White House, not when he came in. Yes, sir.
Could you comment a little bit on how the studies you pointed to, maybe there's a generational breakdown? My daughter went to Davis, and her classmates seem a little more open to things than maybe my generation was, and so I'm just curious.
You know, that's a very astute observation. It does fit with the studies I talked about. I put a lot of time in trying to think of what to say, being scared of running out of, time or going over, whatever. But one of the findings is that in the NID study, particularly, that younger people, on the whole, were becoming more open. The younger people. Now, if there's different kinds of trends. If it's a kind of trend that persists as they get older, then it's going to be a very different world in 20 years. The percentage of people that are open to this is going to be, very, very high. And let's face it, they're brought up in a world that's totally different from mine. I was born in 1940. We were very upper class. We had a car, we had a refrigerator, we had a radio, we had an indoor toilet, and we had a telephone. The big five. Now, the grandkids, they don't know which cell phone is ringing and involved in all. I mean, it's a totally different world, technologically, culturally, and I think we're moving towards openness, awareness of the cosmos. I really believe that. And there's a lot of serious SETI people associated with astrobiology and SETI who write on it. It's called cosmocultural evolution. It goes back to the idea of the noosphere. It's out there, but you don't see it if you read books written by debunkers. And they don't go out of their way to embrace UFOs, but they don't go out of their way to, bash them either. And some are quite open. Thank you. Still take one or two. Okay, thank you. One of my nephews, I mentioned I was speaking here, says, everybody's going to freak out and panic. They're not ready for this. It's going to be terrible. Well, I don't agree. And whenever we talk about speculative topics, whether it's ET, UFOs, or life beyond death, there's some kind of mix of evidence and opinion, and I'm trying to increase the contributions of evidence and reduce the contributions of opinion. It's very difficult because when you address audiences, when it comes right down to it, it's the gut reaction that counts, not the statistical tables, not the experiments, not the survey kinds of results. And it's my belief that even incomplete data can help. My feeling is that one of ufology's biggest problems is not a lack of data, it's too much data, too contradictory and too much conflicting data that makes it difficult to sift through. Almost like in SETI, looking for that civilization out there, the needle in the cosmic haystack. In ufology, it's looking for the real case in this big batch of information. Now, conspiracy theories are prominent in the United States, and they have a long and honorable history. They're proliferating like crazy. Just a few of the historical examples of conspiracies, real or imagined, LBJ in the Vietnam War. He lied to us. It turned out that the destroyers were not fired upon. I remember thinking, oh man, I'm going to get drafted tomorrow, hearing that our ships had been fired upon. Watergate, Iran-Contra scandal, weapons of mass destruction, WikiLeaks. Gee whiz, who would have ever guessed that there might be some monitoring of our communications? Operation PRISM, Snowden, who's sitting in Russia trying to figure out what to do next. And of course, you can go on and on. 9/11, the Kennedy assassination. They're just very, very rampant. And sort of in between religion and science, such as Ted was talking about. And the third is what I call the gumshoe track. And by gumshoe, I'm referring to private investigators. And that involves looking at history, current politics, and saying, what's going on, what can we learn from these various examples? What I'd like to touch upon today, and I can only touch upon, is first of all, what would motivate a government to suppress information confirming the existence of extraterrestrial life? We can pick different terms: disclosure, confirmation, acknowledgement, but why would a government want to keep this information back? The second, if we look at the motives that have been ascribed to government for maintaining secrecy, do these motives really withstand close scrutiny? And I suggest that they don't, although I will only be able to talk about a couple of motives in depth. Are there countervailing motives for transparency or openness? Yes, my goodness, there are tremendous countervailing motives for being open and honest and matters having to do with our place in the universe. Do governments strengthen fears and suspicions that they hope to dispel? I think the answer to this one is yes. That various bureaucratic procedures, the way organizations function under stress, these kinds of things actually enhance the illusion, I don't know about the factuality, enhance the illusion of cover-up. And finally, are we ever going to get out of this mess? Is it possible to somehow get to some point where people are satisfied that they know what's going on and are able to come to grips with this? Okay, now, my big quest, everybody has opinions about SETI, ET, UFOs, extraterrestrial life, and my big quest has been to try to draw on knowledge from the social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, to develop arguments, rather than, oh my God, much. And I point out that although I've been involved in a number of groups, I'm representing myself and my own opinions today. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and other sentient beings as may be present. I'd like to give you a little bit of my background and interest in UFOs. Alfred Adler, the psychologist, pointed out that early memories are very important. And my earliest memory of UFOs, I don't know when it was, but I know it was before 1951 because I remember where we lived. And the news was on the radio, and there had been some kind of sighting or landing. And of course, today I like to convince myself that I was hearing about Roswell, but that's pure imagination. And my father drove home from work, and I said, Dad, the flying saucers, could they come from Mars or other planets? And he thought about it a moment. He said, well, son, he says, I don't know. but I'm sure we'll have all the answers within 6 months. My background's in SETI, and I'm sure everybody here knows that there's been tension between SETI and ufology. And that has a historical basis. And that historical basis is that in the 1950s, 1960s, when SETI was trying to get established, it was trying to distance itself as much as possible from science fiction, from pure speculation, from the Space Brothers, from Orthon, from Mrs. Keach and her Millennial Group. And so that started that militancy. Of the different conspiracy theories, the UFO conspiracy theories, I think, take precedence. That they were fostered during the 1940s and 50s, the Cold War. Everybody's here, I suspect, is aware of what UFO historians have said in works about the history of UFOs, and they're still with us. So I think they're important. If you're just interested in conspiracy theories, I think they're important for 3 reasons. One is seniority, okay? Others have come and gone, like MIAs, missing in actions. If your grandpa's still in North Korea, he's probably dead by now. The second is widespread acceptance by the general public. I don't have the figures for the Trade Center disaster, that it was somehow rigged by our government agencies, but I do. We do have evidence that large numbers of people believe in UFO cover-ups. And then finally, there's the interest expressed by high elected officials, such as President Bill Clinton. Now, conspiracies, they strike you as wrong because they seem unethical, but they're much more, it's much deeper than that. Richard Hofstadter, writing on conspiracies, he wrote a book on the paranoid style in American politics. He didn't really mean paranoid as a psychologist might use it, but what really happened in Dealey Plaza or during a UFO sighting has implications far beyond the suppression of the truth. People strongly perceive conspiracy theories because they represent an assault on the way of life. The real issue is the alleged conspirators violate national traditions and values. There's a discrepancy between the way that, and I think it's eased to some extent over time. The changes have come about because of changes in our own way for searching for life in the universe, and also I think just sort of a slightly more mellow world. I've never been a victim of the open victim of the hostility or ridicule that comes from interest in UFOs. Now, my interest is primarily how people will react, how people think about life on other worlds. And my belief is that you cannot do this without taking UFOs and people who talk about UFOs into account and giving them deep consideration. I have seen discussions of reactions to life on other worlds where there's tremendous care to avoid any hint, mention, or allusion to UFOs, except indirectly, such as having in one case, the person had a Kleenex box covered with aluminum foil and said, of course, there could be a probe in our galaxy. Nobody reacts to that if you're holding up a little silvery thing, about this side. But my personal view, is that we cannot understand our place in the cosmos, our transition from a global to a cosmic society, and do decent planning on easing that transition without looking at UFOs, ufologists, and people's beliefs about UFOs. To try to do otherwise would be like looking at a scene with a semi-detached retina. So I'm very much interested in UFOs. Oh, by the way, a message for the backstage. The countdown clock is not working, but I'm trying to keep track of time anyway. Okay, so everybody here knows that there's basically 3 tracks in ufology. The first is the nuts and bolts science track. Structured craft, how do they work? The second is sort of the semi-mystical, greater consciousness, spirituality track.